Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Recovering the Sacred. I'm James Barbieri, Program Coordinator of the Pari Center and host for this session. As a host, I'm here to help you, so you can feel free to send me a message if you have any problems. Just very quickly, the guidelines for this call, if you can please mute your microphone, just to ensure good quality audio. The chat is open throughout the call, so feel free to use it to share any material or thoughts that arise from this session. And of course, the live captions are on. And this session is, of course, recorded for archival purposes, and for you all, you should receive the recording in a few days. So today we have the honor to be joined by Alex Gomez-Marin and Bernard Carr, who will be discussing towards a transmaterialist science of the sacred. Alex is a Spanish physicist turned neuroscientist and is also the director of the Pari Center. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics and a master's in biophysics from the University of Barcelona. Since 2016, he has been the head of the Behavior of Organisms laboratory at the Instituto de Neuroscientistas in Alicante, and he is an associate professor of the Spanish Research Council. Bernard is a emeritus professor of mathematics and astronomy at Queen Mary University of London. He was president of the Society for Physical Research and is currently the president of the Scientific and Medical Network. For his PhD, he studied under the supervision of Professor Stephen Hawking at the Institute of Astronomy in Cambridge and the California Institute of Technology. Beyond his professional field, he is interested in the role of consciousness in physics and in an expanded paradigm which accommodates the mind. He also has a long-standing interest in the relationship between science and religion. Before we hand it over, I suggest that we all take a 5 minutes of reflection before they begin to engage with the sacred. Again, we have asked Joseph Noel, a young musician from Siena in Italy, to play us the opening aria to Bach's Goldberg variation, which I'll play just now. Wonderful. And with that, I hand it over to you, Alex and Bernard. Welcome.
Thank you. So I will start off by sharing the screen. Right. So does the image appear? The first slide appears. Great. So our title, I should say, first of all, this is a dialogue between myself and Alex. Alex, of course, does these wonderful interviews in The Future Scientist, where he's very much interrogating his subject. But really, Alex has got just as many interesting things to say as I have. So I think this is going to be more of a two-way interview, and it's going to be in the form of a dialogue. And the original title for our session was Towards a Transmaterialist Science of the Sacred. But we made it a little bit more precise because Alex, of course, is an expert on neuroscience. He started off as a physicist, but now he works as a neuroscientist. My area is the cosmos. And so we've entitled this session From Sacred Brain to Sacred Cosmos. And you've got rather a nice image here, which contains a combination of the brain, neuronal connections and galaxies. And the plan, have I gone on to the next screen just to check, James? Yeah, great. We've got a number of topics we're going to talk about. The first is going to be on the three worlds of matter, mind, and spirit, because although we're talking about the sacred, to me, you really got to consider all three of these. And then we're going to talk about the question of how you can extend science to encompass all of these three worlds. That, of course, is implicit in our original title. And then I'm going to give a presentation about my own approach as a cosmologist. So this section is called The Sacred Cosmos and the Hyperspatial Approach, which is my own proposal for extending science. And then Alex is going to talk about the sacred brain, his area of expertise, and the whole question of consciousness. Then we'll get into a general discussion of evolution and life and nature. This is to relate it to the talks, some of the previous talks we've had. And then we'll end up by saying how it all relates to the sacred. Now, I have to say, I'm delighted to see that some of the participants were at the enchantment meeting a few months ago. I wasn't sure if it would be the same audience, so there'd be some overlap between what I said on that occasion, but I know at least some of you weren't there, so I hope that will be useful. There's also, I should say that I'm going to use slides, and Alex is not going to use slides. Alex is much better with words than I am. I tend to need pictures to help me get across what I'm trying to say. So in that sense, the dialogue may be somewhat unbalanced, but we'll see how it goes in any case. And I might say I was delighted that we started off with music, James, because originally I was going to play some music during our presentation, but actually it turns out for technical reasons I can't play any music. So the music was what we started with, which was very nice. So let's start off, and I will start off showing some slides, and then we'll go over to Alex. So we'll be going back and forth. I want to point out that we really all inhabit three worlds. There's the world of matter, there's the world of mind, and there's the world of spirit. Now, this can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, it can refer to our paths in life. You might be a scientist, or you might be an artist, or you might be a mystic. And obviously, we all tend to focus on one of these particular worlds more than the others, depending on our interests. Most scientists obviously are mainly spending their lives thinking about matter. Most artists are mainly talking about art, which I'm now regarding as mind, and mystics are more involved in the world of spirit. But to some extent, we're all involved in these different in these different worlds. And of course, it's very important for humanity as a whole that people do focus in this way on different worlds. But nevertheless, I'm going to argue that it's very important for individuals, but also humanity as a whole, to have a balance of these three worlds. So those are our paths in life. But you can also interpret this in other ways. You can think about these as three ways in which we experience the world: through the senses, through reason, through contemplation. And indeed, you can think of them as three worlds of different academic disciplines: the sciences, the humanities, or religious studies. So these worlds can be interpreted in different ways. But what I want to point out is that actually they are all sacred. Now, you might imagine the sacred is uniquely associated with the world of spirit. But I take the view that actually the sacred is everywhere, in the world of matter, the world of mind, and the world of spirit. And actually, when we had the meeting a few months ago at Pari on enchantment, I had the same diagram, but I put enchantment in the middle rather than sacred. But actually, I think there's a close link between sacred and enchantment. But what's really important, in my view, is that we should have bridges between these three worlds. They're not disconnected worlds, you have to bridge them. Now, those bridges take different forms for different people. For me personally, the bridge between matter and mind is psychical research. When you introduced me, I think you accidentally said physical research, but I mean, the word was psychical research, James, which of course studies those phenomena of mind, like telepathy and precognition and things, which are very controversial, sometimes called psi, because they involve a direct link between mind and the physical world. I'm also interested in what you might call transpersonal psychology, which are sort of more mystical type experiences, which are distinct from the psychic experiences. So, and they draw a link between mind and spirit. And of course, the link between matter and spirit, or science and mysticism, can take many forms. In my professional life, I've been interested in what's called the anthropic principle, which says there are fine tunings which are unexplained, which seem to be necessary for us to be here. So to me, it's always crucial to have those bridges. But the other thing to stress is that a bridge is uncomfortable, because most people don't like having a bridge. So, for example, with psychical research, the scientists don't like it because they don't believe in the phenomena, and the mystics tend not to like it because they don't like to think it's something to do with physics or science or anything like that. And the anthropic principle is also very controversial because some scientists don't like it because it sounds too theological. But nevertheless, it's important to make those bridges. And the bridges, I should say, are not only in the outside world and in these disciplines, it's also a bridge within the brain. And this is where Alex comes in. I think one individually has to try and make a bridge between these different worlds in one's own brain. And I think this is something that Alex might say something about. Now, at this stage, I was going to talk about the why I think there is a sacred element in the physical world. And I was going to tell the story of how I became a cosmologist. And what this happened because I think in 1969, there was a TV documentary called The Violent Universe, which I watched. And there was a scene in this where Martin Schmidt, who's an astronomer, he was going out to Mount Palomar and he was looking through a telescope at a distant quasar. And as he watched this quasar, millions of light years away, he played some music, and he played Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony, the third movement. And this was so moving to me that I decided, first of all, to become an astronomer. And I decided also to buy Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, because up until then, I only had Beatle records. So to me, it was, what was special about that moment was that I realized that when Schmidt was looking at this distant quasar, it wasn't just a scientific enterprise, it was actually a spiritual, it was an emotional, a spiritual experience as well. That was for me personally. Now, at this point, I was going to play Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, but I don't think it works. I can hear it, but you can't. Is that correct? Just to confirm, nobody can hear anything?
No,
you can't. Okay, well, it was just to say it was the Allegretto Shepherd's song. And as this is playing, it goes through various images of nature, such as the trees and the, well, it's Walden Pond and the surrounding woods. Obviously, I'm not going to show this because you can't hear the music. But I wanted to just link it to the talks we had from Mary Jane, Russ, and Peter Reason, which very much emphasized the importance of nature. But I can't play the music, so I'm going to go on. So actually, those of you who were at the enchantment meeting will have heard the music anyway. So let me now go on. Sorry, to the next slide. Now, I want to, at this point, explain where I come from as a scientist. And again, this was a figure I showed at the enchantment meeting, but it's so central, I want to show it again for the people who weren't there. The point I want to make is that science, or physics in particular, has involved an expansion of our knowledge to ever larger and smaller scales of the physical universe. And it's been triumphant in explaining all these different levels of structure. This is my favorite diagram. It's called the cosmic Ouroboros, and it's the snake which swallows its own tail. And you can think of it as a sort of ruler. And as you go anti-clockwise from the top, the scale increases by a factor of 10. So you go all the way from the smallest things in the universe, all the way down at the bottom, you've got human beings. And then as you go to the right, you've got larger things like mountains and planets and stars, solar systems, galaxies, and the universe. As you go to the left, you have smaller things like ants and amoebas, DNA, atoms, and atomic nuclei, and things like that. So as you go around this snake, you go through something like 60 decades of scale. So it's a little bit like a clock. And I'm just going to quickly go through the history of physics to show you why this represents the expansion of our consciousness, essentially, to ever larger scale. So I'm going to do this quickly, especially since many of you have already heard this. So astronomy involves the outward journey. And we started off with a geometric view. I'm just showing these images here. But then we realized with Copernicus that actually the Earth isn't the center of the universe, but the sun is. So we have the heliocentric view. And then we eventually realized that we knew the sun was one of billions of 100 billion stars in the galaxy, but then for a while the galactocentric view prevailed, but then we realized the galaxy itself is only just one of billions of galaxies, and then we have the cosmocentric view. And now we even think that there are many universes beyond the visible horizon, and that's the so-called multiverse picture. And so that's been an enormous triumph. But of course, it's also made us very insignificant. And but what is interesting when you study this, when you contemplate our observations of the universe, it isn't just a matter of scientific knowledge. I'm sure you're all aware of the latest pictures from the James Webb Telescope. Now, at this point, I was going to play some music, Across the Universe by John Lennon. accompanied to some images. Well, I can't do that. I can't show the music. So I'm just going to show the images, and you can imagine whatever music you want. I'm sure you've seen these in the media, but I'll just quickly go through them. So that's the Jupiter. And I don't want you to worry about what they actually are. I just want you to appreciate the beauty of it. It would be more moving with the music, but this is the Carina Nebula, where stars are being born. There's a close-up. It's like the hand of God. This is a planetary nebula, a star which is blown up. This is a galaxy. It's a spiral galaxy, but ours doesn't look quite like this. It's called the Phantom Galaxy. There's another galaxy, a spiral galaxy. I mean, I just want to get across how beautiful it is. These are two galaxies. Galaxies come in groups sometimes, and these are two galaxies interacting like two people. And here's another group of galaxies. If you look at the galaxy in the middle, you have a big black hole in the center, which is squirting out high energy jets. And then, of course, this is the view of a most distant view of lots of galaxies looking out really almost to the edge of the universe. So every dot there is a galaxy. That's the most distant, at least it was the most distant galaxy. It no longer is, but nevertheless, you can't see much, but that is the galaxy, formed just maybe a billion years after the Big Bang. And this isn't from the James Webb Telescope, but this is a picture of what's called the microwave background, which when this was discovered and observed for the first time, the color corresponds to the temperature. George Smoot called this the face of God. But that's the microwave background, which it goes back to before galaxy formation. It was when the background radiation, which bathes the whole universe, and is the evidence for the Big Bang, was last scattered off the matter. And it conveys a huge amount of information. All of these pictures convey a huge amount of information, but the point I want to get across is that it's beautiful, and it's actually, to me at least, it is even sacred. But going back to this picture, then there's the inward journey, and the inward journey goes to ever smaller scales with microscopes and particle accelerators. So we've got the discovery of atoms. Then the atoms have got nuclei with all these subatomic particles, the quarks. There's the Standard Model, which has got different types of quarks. And then there's the famous Higgs boson, which was discovered some years ago, sometimes called the God particle. And then our final theory, M theory, for example, which is meant to be our final theory of everything, is at the smallest scale of all. And so that's describing the inward journey. But the point I want to make is that this, of course, represents the triumph. To me, I love this picture because it summarizes our knowledge of the universe, but it also summarizes the way in which we've been able to, it represents the unity of the universe, the way everything fits together. There seems to be like a great intelligence behind it all. But there's something missing. And what's missing here is that really this is missing mind. It's all about the physical world. So in some sense, this represents the triumph of mindlessness. And yet, I think there are good reasons to believe that mind is a fundamental and not incidental to the universe. I'm talking about mind rather than spirit, but spirit is going to come in shortly. And so really, that is actually, in some sense, the starting point for me, that somehow mind is missing and we've got to get mind into the picture. On the theory of physics, of course, in the micro world, we've got quantum theory. In the macro world, we've got relativity theory, that's on the left and the right, respectively. But as I think is well known, quantum theory and relativity theory are not the final theories, they're incompatible. So the question is, will the final theory of physics, which we don't have yet, will this marriage of quantum and relativity theory, will it accommodate mind? And what I want to try and argue is that it will. And in some sense, this is going to come in at the top of this Ouroboros. I should also say the top, incidentally, corresponds to the Big Bang. That's why the Ouroboros, the snake is swallowing its own tail. Because when you look to large distances, you're looking back in time when the universe was very, very small. Now, I'm therefore, I'm not going to show this either. I was going to show that physicists are very keen to have the theory of everything, and I was just going to make the point here that really it isn't a theory of everything, it's just a theory of particle physics. And I was going to mention the film, The Theory of Everything, which was about Stephen Hawking and his wife, their love affair. As I think James mentioned, Stephen was my PhD supervisor, and I went to the premiere of the film, and was fortunate to sit next to Stephen. And I had a little joke that he found the theory of everything. The next day, the newspaper headlines, Stephen Hawking finds the theory of everything enjoyable. And but of course, he didn't actually find the theory of, unfortunately, hadn't found the theory of everything by the time he died. But really, the reason I mentioned this was that the theory of everything was about his love affair with Jane, and it was not really about his theory of physics at all. It was only mentioned really parenthetically. So to me, that's the irony, that the one thing a theory of everything is not going to explain is love, I guess, and more spiritual aspects. Now, so why do we think mind is important? Well, there are all sorts of arguments, and I also went through these, so I'm not going to get at the enchantment meeting, so I'll only do very, very quickly that the comprehensibility of the universe, Jean said it's more like a great thought than a great machine. The beauty of the universe, from Dirac, it's more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. And of course, beauty is a feature of mind. The anthropic principle, this is one of the things I work on in cosmology. The idea is that there are these fine tunings within physics which cannot be explained, but they seem to be required for our existence, the existence of observers. And this relates to whether you've got a multiverse or the relationship between God and the multiverse. I think everybody is aware of quantum theory. I'm not going to say much about quantum theory, but one knows that quantum theory completely changes our view of reality. And the objects are described by wave functions, and in some sense, those wave functions can collapse when you have a consciousness present. And so you've even got the idea that the universe itself is born and gives rise to consciousness, which may bring the universe into existence. And so and Henry Stapp even thinks that the mind can select the way in which quantum collapse takes place. And of course, you're all aware of David Bohm's work on the implicit order which underlies the physical world. So this, for the first time in physics, hints that consciousness may play a role. But quantum theory itself is not a complete description. It shows that consciousness may be relevant, mind may be relevant to the physical universe, but it's not a complete explanation. And as I mentioned, I'm interested in psychic phenomena. This is, of course, controversial among scientists, but I mean things like telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition, psychokinesis. But the point is, they imply that you actually, if this is true, consciousness does interact with the physical world. And therefore, you need to have some extension of physics to do that. Even those physicists themselves, there's opposition both from physicists and even parapsychologists to this idea, because physicists don't believe in the phenomena and parapsychologists don't always want to relate it to physics because that seems a bit reductionist. So going back then to this cosmic Ouroboros, as I said, the question is, will the marriage of quantum and relativity theory accommodate mind? And if it does, in some sense, this implies that at the top of the Ouroboros, you in some sense get the end of the matter-centric view. Now, I've talked about mind, but what about God? Is there room for God here? This is a picture which maybe God is selecting the fine tunings. That is, you don't have to take that view. You can take a multiverse view, but you might also say, well, maybe God, in some sense, he created the laws which govern the universe. So obviously there's different levels at which one can talk about this. I've always been fascinated in the miracle of mathematics. Math underlies physics, physics underlies the universe creates life, which creates mind, which creates mathematics. So you've got this circle. I love this quote from Russell: the true spirit of delight, the exaltation, the sense of being more than man, which is the touchstone of the highest excellence, is to be found in mathematics as surely as in poetry. And some people even say that numbers are the language of God, although I actually tend to prefer Rumi's statement that silence is the language, all else is mere translation. Now, the question is, though, does one see evidence for the divine in the universe? And I have to say that physicists themselves have very different views, but I would say the deepest physicists do generally see a spiritual aspect in the universe. There's a wonderful book by Ken Wilber, Quantum Questions, and here are some of the chapters. These were people who did, but of course it's also true that most physicists don't. Most physicists see evidence against God, if you like. So the evidence for God, if you want to believe in God, really comes from inside rather than outside. And this is a well-known quote: the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It's the source of all true art and all science. Those to whom emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, are as good as dead. Their eyes are closed. Now, I've spoken for too long, Alex, and this is the first topic. In theory, we should be talking only for about 15 minutes for each topic. So we're going to talk about extended science next, but Alex, would you like to come in at this point and say something about the three worlds, and maybe even say how you got interested in the three worlds in the way that I have?
Yes, all right, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I'm doubly grateful because
Can you talk a bit louder, by the way? I can't quite hear you.
Let's see, is it better now?
Yes, I think it's very muffled, Alex. It seems like it might be the microphone.
Yeah. Okay.
Now it should be good.
Much better, yes.
Yes. Sorry, I'm having a weird day today. Okay, so I was saying I'm doubly grateful first to John Pickering for curating this series and having Bernard as a guest, who in turn made me a guest of his presentation today. So thank you to both. And yes, I want to say something about the three worlds, but before, I also wanted to add a couple of caveats that we'll probably discuss at the very end, which is that what Bernard and I are trying to do today will certainly sound abstract and even commit the popular sin of left hemisphere talking, right? So first of all, forgiveness, and second of all, a defense of doing that, because as our beloved Ian McGilchrist explains in his last chapter of The Matter with Things, there's 111 pages talking about the sense of the sacred. The right hemisphere version of the sacred could be animism, and the left hemisphere version could be theology or process theology. And in a way, both are honorable. So maybe he were more on the left side of things, especially talking about these through all these abstractions. But I hope that it also seems something necessary to work out to you. We can discuss this later. And the second introductory caveat was that yes, we entitled it towards a transmaterialist science of the sacred, but perhaps it's more that we're tending or attempting a kind of sacred science more than a science of the sacred. And I think these are also kind of large themes for discussion later. Now, as to the three worlds, well, I'm always puzzled about why number 3, and we can discuss this. But what I'm very interested about, what Bernard, what you propose is this funny fact that given these 3 worlds, these breaches are polemic. So I wanted to start with that. One tendency is to say, well, I'll ignore this other circle. If I'm comfortable in one breach, in one node, I'll ignore the circle at the other, and if I cannot ignore it, I'll conquer it. We seem to be trapped in this. So I'll pretend it doesn't exist, but if it's bothering too much, I'll try to just absorb it, and probably neither are good solutions. And I think that's why we used the word very deliberately, transmaterialist science of the sacred. And the idea here is, and that I think that's also another thing very valuable that you, Bernard, bring to the table, is that the physical world is not second class. And because we're surrounded by, let's physicalists or materialists, in order to emphasize the other worlds, there's this kind of paradox, irony, even a tragedy, where we end up in a way diminishing the value of the material world. And so that's why the prefix trans can be valuable here. And so just to add a couple of more things, and then I'll hand it back to you, Bernard. I was thinking about what the sacred is, and of course it's hard. So I thought, well, what it is not, maybe through an antonym rather than a synonym, I can get a better sense of what we're talking about here. And so if you simply Google it or check it, well, the opposite is secular or even profane. And so I double-clicked on profane and looked for what it meant etymologically. And it has to do with being outside the temple. That's fabulous, because nowadays temples are the laboratories. So, but we want to avoid that bifurcation. So if there was one main message of not what I want to tell you, but what I'm actually trying, is to avoid this bifurcation between the sacred and the secular, or the sacred and the profane, as we're doing science. And so that implies first that we conceive a kind of divinization of matter. And the second one that I throw to the table is the spiritualization of the scientist. And that's the main reason why I've actually conceived the Future Scientist series. So, sorry, because I also did kind of a little presentation, but I wanted to start with kind of what I consider the main themes of what we're trying to do. But then we can continue with what you mentioned, which is, so we are working, you and I at least are working to extend science, avoiding scientism, of course, but to extend science and see how much it can stretch to cover these worlds. And we don't know how much, and we don't know either whether it will break or at which point we should stop and acknowledge that science no longer makes it there. So I wanted to start with that.
Thank you, Alex. And so I'll now go on to the continue with the discussion of the actual extension of science, and whether this can be extended. With that, of course, relates to what Alex was just saying when he was talking. He was making a distinction between post-materialism and transmaterialist view. And so let me just say a little bit about scientism. Again, I think most people probably appreciate this, but scientism assumes that first of all, materialism, that matter is the only reality. Reductionism, which says that the local interactions of bits of matter obeying known laws are going to explain everything. And then there is what you might say epiphenomenalism, which is saying consciousness is generated by the brain. And obviously, Alex is going to have a lot to say about that. And then, of course, atheism, the view that religion and spirituality and mystical insights are simply, in some sense, illusions generated by the brain. Now, I'm assuming that for people listening now, all four of these views don't make sense. But one has to face the fact that most scientists probably, I won't say most scientists, but quite a number of scientists do take these views. But this is not science itself. This is a very extreme fundamentalist form of science, which is sometimes called scientism. And the point is that if one believes, if you can have three views of mental and spiritual realms. The first view is that they're simply illusions generated by the brain. That is the dogma of scientism. But you can have another view. You can say, well, these are real in some sense. In other words, I attribute value to mental and spiritual experiences, but they're just not part of science. But then you can have the third view, which is the one which I'm going to push, and I think that Alex is going to agree with me about this, that you actually can extend science to include them. And this is just an image I use where the scientism believes in the grass, and every time there's a flower, it tries to stamp it out. So these things, the mental and spiritual realms in this metaphor it's the flower, if you like. But the question is, can science be extended from these three worlds? And this is the point I really want to stress. If we normally assume that science is associated with the material world, but I would argue that you need to extend it to include the mental world. And I've given various reasons for why mind should be considered, part of science. But in particular, in psychical research, psychic phenomena, if real, implies that the mind has a direct interaction with the physical world. And therefore, if you think your world model of physics is correct, it must be able to accommodate that. And actually, that's fairly non-controversial, because now, because of developments in cognitive science and well, we talked about quantum theory and the possibility that consciousness arises there, but also, of course, developments in neuroscience. This is not so controversial. There are plenty of famous physicists who will be happy with this idea. Not all of them, but people like Roger Penrose, for example, would be very happy to think of an extended science. But I'm going even further than that. I'm saying that you have to have a science which can be expanded to incorporate the spiritual world as well. And that's a third step, which is more controversial. So you need an extension of science, I'm claiming, which explicitly involves consciousness, because of course consciousness is involved in all three of these worlds. I mean, it's not to say that consciousness is just involved in the world of mind and spirit makes no sense, because in fact consciousness has to be within the world of, it's in all three worlds. Just as I said, the sacred links all three worlds, so does consciousness. And as I think people probably know, I'm involved in the Scientific Metal Network, and we're very much pushing what's called the view, what is normally called the postmaterialist view, but which Alex argues should be called the transmaterialist view. And we had this Galileo Commission document, which sort of is pushing this view. And I will also mention the fact that I've been involved to some extent in the Esalen Center, which has been very influential. I make this quote because I think it's so important. We think it requires astonishing hubris to dismiss en masse the collective wisdom and experience of a large proportion of our forebears, including persons widely recognized as pillars of all human civilization. And we believe that the single most important task confronting all of modernity is that of meaningful reconciliation of science and religion. One needs a middle way between the polarized fundamentalisms of science and religion, an enlarged conception of nature anchored in science and spiritual realities. And that is what I think is, that's also my view. Now, these three books, I'm running short of time, so I won't go through those in detail. I will then show this figure again. I hope I'm not talking too long, but this is another figure I'm very fond of, because it talks about all the different experiences one can have. And it's a plot of frequency on the vertical axis and impact on the horizontal axis, going from common to rare, vertically, mundane.
Oh, Bernard, we're not seeing your slides now. You need to share them again.
I need to share them again. Okay. Sorry about when did that happen?
Well, since I hand it over to you, unfortunately.
Oh my goodness, you missed all the previous slides. Was I not sharing them?
The second time, no, but it was fine. I could follow you, and I hope the rest also could.
Oh no, sorry.
Yeah.
So I stopped sharing. That's what happened, and I didn't start again. Oh no. Okay, sorry about this. This is really irritating. I'm going to have to
I think it wasn't really necessary until you were describing these two axes of this figure.
I understand. I'll just have to go through them. So now I have to share. Thanks for telling me. I wish I'd known earlier. Am I sharing now?
Yes, now we can see your desktop.
Oh no. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go through at lightning speed now, because okay, the dogmas of scientism. Okay, three views of mental, spiritual realms, the foot which is stamping out the flower. Can science be extended to mind? Science is normally in the physical world, now extend it to mind, and then we try and extend it to spirit as well. But there is consciousness in the middle, linking them all. And that was the image of the Galileo Commission report. This was the image of the Esalen Center. I read out the those important quotes, but there they are in print form. And then I'll now get up to the experiences. So what I want to do on this figure, I just want to represent the various experiences we have. In other words, experience as opposed to experiment. That's the point. So our experiences, things like sensations and memories and dreams, they're normal mental experiences. Telepathy, clairvoyance, distant healing, premonitions, they're what you might call paranormal experiences, which of course mainstream science isn't keen on. And then we have creative insights, religious epiphany, oceanic feelings, mystical union. Those are what you might call the spiritual experiences. So everybody has the normal, healers and psychics have the paranormal, and of course geniuses and saints have the spiritual ones. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is a continuum. There's no clear-cut distinction between psychic and spiritual phenomena. So if you want to extend physics to accommodate mind, you have to accommodate all three of these: normal, paranormal, and if you like, transpersonal mind. And that's a point which, which sometimes isn't made. And it's just important to stress we don't yet even have a theory of physics which accommodates normal mind, let alone paranormal or spiritual mind. Never mind this. But I would say the one thing that you learn from these phenomena, psi and creativity, mystical experiences, is that there is some form of universal mind. This is a famous Emerton quote: "There is one mind common to all individual men, a universal mind. Deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty, and if we don't see it, it's because we are blinding ourselves to it." But if there's only one mind, how come we've got our individual minds? And the idea here is that the brain is a filter, and this is where Alex is going to come in. Huxley: each one of us is potentially mind at large, but insofar as we are animals, our business at all costs is to survive, to make a biological survival possible. Mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and the nervous system. This, of course, is not the mainstream view of neuroscience, but I think there is evidence for it. I'll be interested to see how Alex responds to this. Evidence, for example, near-death experience, psychedelics, savant syndrome, terminal lucidity. And the general view is, for reductionist physics, is that throughout the history of the universe, you build up complexity. So, you start off with quarks and making nucleons and atoms, biomolecules, cells, organisms, consciousness through a process of evolution. You're building up ever more complex systems. And in some sense, brains and consciousness are just regarded as the culmination of complexity. And so that is the view in which the brain produces consciousness. So that's what 90% of scientists would believe. So how can it be wrong? Well, the idea is that there is consciousness with a big C underlying everything, and that this consciousness is merely filtered through the brain to produce consciousness with a little c. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop again. So this is the discussion of why we need a transpersonal, or a post-materialist or transmaterialist science. I have to say I agree with Alex about the term transmaterialism, because it's rather like in transpersonal psychology. You wouldn't call it post-personal, post-psychology rather than post-personal psychology. But at this point, let me stop and bring you in again, Alex. Now, I'm going to stop sharing at this point. Okay, and I bring you in again, Alex. Obviously, I know you're going to have a lot to say about brain and consciousness and things.
Yes.
Whether you believe in the what I was saying about the filter theory.
All right. Okay. So let me go back again to the title, and we use the word towards, which is a word you use when you write a grant and you want money, you don't really know where you're going. It's a dangerous word to use. But let me also zoom out and emphasize that, at least I speak for me, I think also for Bernard, the word towards here signifies that not only are we aware and may agree with you and share the views of what it is not, like, okay, the natural world is not just, or it's not a machine, or consciousness is not something produced inside the head, and so on. Not only are we, of course, putting forth this denunciation of what is not, but we're also trying to figure out what may be. And Bernard is doing it from cosmology, and I'm doing it from neuroscience. And so this towards implies it's work in progress. Now, this work betrays a kind of ambitious humility we have here, which I may contrast it with the usual humble hubris of many people that say, well, we have to learn so much, but basically we got the right philosophy, the right metaphysics, the right questions. We just need to work more and get more detail. So I want to contrast it with that. We don't know, but we're trying to figure it out. And again, that might sound a bit ambitious, and probably it is, but I hope that we're not missing this humility in trying to figure these things out. Now, as since we're discussing these prefixes, let me talk about prefixes too. Whether it's trans or post materialist, what should be used, that's not a big deal right now. But realize how the prefix neuro, from neuroscience, neuromarketing, even like calling it neurosacred would be horrible, right? But if it seems like if you add neuro to some words, their value multiplies by 10. And then note the paradox too, or the trick of language, that if you use other prefixes, the value of certain things or fields of inquiry or phenomena seems to halve or be divided by 10. So if you add pseudo instead of before science, you get pseudoscience, right? It's a big insult. If you add para in front of psychology, you get parapsychology. Oof, look, if we hadn't enough with psychology, you even talk about parapsychology. Or if you add the word super, we all like Superman, but if you add super to supernatural, it's like, okay, now you were talking nonsense again. That's what's usually implied, right? And so I think Bernard is brave here in bringing this on the table. And I'm not going to share a slide, but I was drawing on a piece of paper here. I kind of map, let's imagine the Lord of the Rings, and a map with shaping borders. And so in this map, we could talk about what's science and what is not science, what is bad science, but still done in laboratories. So it's kind of still science, it's just bad science, or could be better science. Then what's dogmatic science, but then what's pseudoscience and why, and whether it's pseudoscience in some occasions or it's heretic science. So it's another family of, or another region in this map, a kind of Tolkien map, where, well, heretic science maybe belongs to the boundaries of science, but it's more than marginalized. So, and I was imagining all these boundaries shaping, and they shape in time. And we only need to speak about the history of physics or science writ large to realize that what was considered not scientific then became perhaps heretic science, and then it became heterodox, and then it became orthodox, and then it became dogma, and so on, right? So this also again brings some sort of humility to this whole discussion, because what was believed 100 years ago has changed in some respect considerably. Now, I want to say what I think about neuroscience and the brain, but before, I would like to hear in more detail, and I think that's what you've prepared, Bernard, how you address this work in progress that the word toward signifies, and you're doing it through dimensions, right? Through the idea of hyperdimensional. So why don't we go into that, and then I'll bring in my own attempts to make the brain sacred and not an idol. I'll tell you about this later. But first, let's see how you want to make the cosmos sacred.
Okay.
The hyperdimensional model.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. But and the point you make about these various pronouns is really important. You know, I mean, you can talk about pseudoscience, superscience, parascience, and all this. But maybe one should also stress, even before the pronoun, what one means by science, because when I talk about science, I generally mean I'm assuming there are some laws which govern, control the behavior of the universe, but that these laws perhaps can be expressed in some mathematical form. Yeah. But one has to realize that what we mean by science has changed dramatically throughout the history of science. You know, we used to think that science had to involve experiments, but if you're an astronomer, you can't experiment with the universe. With the universe, you've got millions of stars and millions of galaxies, so the universe can do the experiments for you. But when you come to cosmology, you've only got one universe, so you can't even do that. So, and of course, when you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about first personhood as opposed to the third person perspective. So the whole question of whether you can expand science does depend crucially on what you mean by science. And you're right, and all these pronouns which you mentioned, in some sense, that seems to me they're all reflections on what you mean by science, because there will be a controversy about what we mean by science in itself.
Let me add here, because now you prompted me to say something. Maybe we can be a bit in more quick dialogue mode, and then immediately you want to share your slides. I think the easiest and coarse but good definition of what science is what scientists make of it, and that may sound too relativistic, but that emphasizes that science is also a social activity and in a way a construct. And I don't want to get here into whether everything is made up, but let me briefly share this thing that happened to me last Thursday. So a couple of days ago, I was invited to give a talk at a place where they work on material sciences, and then they showed me the microscopes, and they had this 3.5 million microscope. they're shooting electrons at little thin layers of stuff they produce very carefully. And then they showed us on the screen a picture of atoms, you know, atoms on a screen. You know, the Greeks would be thrilled to see those little balls there. And I was thinking, well, how am I really seeing atoms there? And it's all enough. They felt to me like an affordance. The affordance is this idea from ecological psychology and cognitive science, that objects and subjects are intrinsically related. So when you're looking at something that you think is out there, like a ladder, for instance, that's a typical example, a ladder is not a ladder out there irrespective of me. It's an opportunity. It offers me, it affords me something to climb on. So a ladder is climbable. So we're not talking about prefixes here, but suffixes here. So the able at the end what it refers back to me as what it can offer me. So then I thought about Bruno Latour, who died a couple of months ago, and
sorry,
Bruno Latour, the French philosopher and sociologist of France. And he has a last interview he gave in the summer. I recommend you all to go and find it. It's in French, subtitled in Spanish. And he explains so beautifully the types of truths: juridic truths, religious truths, scientific truths. So he would say, well, some things are true scientifically, but others are true maybe technically, and others are true in terms of law. So just to emphasize, of course, science has its methodologies, but we're sometimes deluded. I'm finishing this footnote, long footnote. We're sometimes deluded by being told the science or the scientific method, right? This is, in my view, the return of the repressed. Is the idea that we left religion aside, God, the sacred, but still sometimes science speaks and operates as if there was the scientific truth up there. And back to the definition of profane, inside the temple, and the temple as this consecrated space, as if everything that's outside this space, in that case, what scientists do in their laboratories was profane, and then what scientists say is sacred. And I'm tired of these headlines, and I need to denounce it here again. Blah, 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 comma, experts say, or scientists say, right? So, well, I needed to add that. And also I kind of a triangle, three worlds appear to mind, like the scientific world, the religious/spiritual world, and the state. And there has been a separation between religion and state, but science and state are also related in a very intriguing way that we could also discuss. Sorry, I think I went wildly off course.
No, not at all. That's very interesting, and I certainly didn't have state. I suppose state would come in the mind box if I was going to put it in any box at all. But I was particularly struck with what you said about really what is science is defined sociologically, and that's an important point, because even within physics, there's a controversy about what counts as physics. Is M theory physics or maths?
Yes.
And at the end of the day, you can argue it's a matter of semantics, but I simply take the view that physics is what physicists do. And the fact of the matter is that the people who work on M theory are physicists. They work in physics departments. So from a pragmatic point of view, that is physics. But it raises another point, that if we really are going to extend science to include the sacred, to include the mental and the spiritual, it would imply that the scientists themselves must become more spiritual, which is something to bear in mind. Anyway, I'll continue with the train of thought. By the way, James, can I just ask you? We obviously started about an hour ago, and obviously that people want to discuss things, the participants want to raise questions. How much longer can we go on for?
We can go maybe 10 extra minutes at the end of the hour. Just
okay, well, let's see how we go. I mean, let's see how we go, because Alex has asked me, and I'm happy to do it. Indeed, I'd prepared to do it. So I'm now going to share screen again. So I'm coming on to my third part of my talk now, which was to talk about my own particular model. Now, bear in mind, this is very speculative. Most physicists won't believe it, but nevertheless, this is what I'm rather passionate about. And I did speak about it again at the enchantment meeting. So let me just remind you that the standard classical view of Newton was that the arena of reality is three-dimensional space, backwards, forwards, up and down, left and right, and of course, time. And the idea that space and time are absolute. So this underlies the entire classical view. Of course, there's all of the laws of mechanics and things as well, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about the arena, if you like, of physics. But we all know, of course, that that view was superseded by Einstein, because he realized that the arena of reality is four-dimensional space-time. And I can't get into details here, but the idea is that with people, you have, according to their motions, an observer may have different time and space axes, which would mean that they measure different times and lengths. And the point about this four-dimensional picture is that time is the fourth dimension. And so an observer, an object or a person, corresponds to a world line in this diagram. So as time proceeds, you can see the point is moving to the left and right in space. And a light ray, for example, always travels at 45 degrees, and that's how we see the world. And so that's the Einstein view, that the world is actually four-dimensional. Now, but the point to realize, though, is that modern physics tells us that actually they're more than four dimensions, because Einstein was trying to talk about, he was describing gravity in his general theory of relativity, which says that space-time is curved in some sense. But there are other forces in nature. And for example, Kaluza and Klein in about the 1920s, they realized that they could have a unified model of gravity and electromagnetism if there was an extra spatial dimension, in other words, a fifth dimension. But this fifth dimension had to be wrapped up very, very small. It had to be wrapped up on what's called the Planck scale, which is the scale at the top of the cosmic Ouroboros, 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And this is quite a beautiful theory, but people more or less forgot about it until, because of the developments in quantum theories, distracted people. But actually, then in the 1980s, it was realized that you could describe all the interactions by invoking more wrapped up dimensions. This is when string theory, superstring theory came along. And in fact, they needed to have 6 extra dimensions. So you had a 10-dimensional space, the 4 macroscopic dimensions of space and time, but you have these 6 extra dimensions wrapped up very small. There were different versions of superstring theory, and then in the mid-1990s, they realized that all these theories could be merged in what's called M theory, which I've already referred to. And this M theory has 1 extra dimension, so it's an 11-dimensional theory. So the point I want to make is that the history of physics is a history of increasing dimensionality from 3 dimensions to 4 dimensions, 5 dimensions, 10 dimensions, 11 dimensions. Now, of course, this sounds crazy. It seems to have no connection with our common sense reality. But then physics departed from common sense reality a long time ago, with quantum theory, of course. And so that's the important, that's the price you pay essentially for the unified. These theories are giving a beautiful unified model of all the interactions of physics as part of this great cosmic Ouroboros connecting the left and the right sides. But really, it is no more than a mental model. And indeed, in some sense, that's ironic when physicists say mind is irrelevant, because actually the theory of reality which we get from physics is a mental model. We have a sequence of paradigm shifts, which are basically mental models. They're not what we experience. But what particularly fascinated me was that the idea that in one particular version, you take one of these dimensions and you say it's extended. And then you have the idea that the physical world is a brain, a 4-dimensional brain, B-R-A-N-E, in a 5-dimensional bulk. And that's I want you just to remember this, because this is going to relate to what I'm going to go on to say, my own model. So we're saying the material world is just a slice of a higher dimensional reality structure. So more generally, therefore, what I want to argue is that space and time are unified in space-time. Matter and mind are unified in a process of observations. Space-time, of course, is explained by relativity theory, observation by quantum theory. So what I'm saying is we need a unification of matter, mind, space, and time. Although we are going to have to radically revise what we mean by those terms. Now, now let me go into a philosophical domain, which is going to, I think, relate to what Alex is going to say. What do we mean by reality? In a classical view, you have a cat, you've got two brains. The idea is that there is a little inside the brain, there is an image of a cat in each side of the brain, but that the brain just produces an internal map of the outside world. But the outside world is objective and studied by science. The little cat in the brain is just something in your brain, which is private. That's the standard view. And so when you talk about reality from a three-dimensional perspective, from a classical perspective, what you mean is there exists this three-dimensional space, I'll read it out, in which are localized both the physical objects and the senses through which we observe the objects. Each observer has only partial information about this space because we see things from a certain perspective. But there exists a three-dimensional configuration which gives the two-dimensional projections concordant with those presented. So reality is a three-dimensional structure which consistently reconciles our perceptions of it. So I can represent that by this little picture here. Here are these perceptual fields, squares, and the reality structure is represented as a cube, but that's just a sort of a metaphorical image. But we know that's wrong, because we know that when we go to relativity theory, the world is four-dimensional. It's not three-dimensional. And this completely changes our view of reality. We observe along past light cones. I'm going to miss out that picture. But so if we ask what is our experience of the world, I can draw a space-time diagram here. So you imagine your brain, which is a world line. This is a present moment, and you're looking, when you observe the world, what you're seeing is the part of space-time which is connected to your brain via some causal link. It might be a light ray, that's the edge of this nexus, or it might be a sound wave. But basically, it's what I call a space-time outlook tree. Your experience of the world is the part of space-time to which you're connected. So perception is a four-dimensional process, and this corresponds to what you might call an extended mind. So the standard view is that the percept is in your brain. So you've got the star out there, and you've got the star in your brain. The star out there is real. The star in your brain is created by your neuronal processes and is internal. From a four-dimensional perspective, this doesn't make any sense. From a four-dimensional perspective, perception is a four-dimensional process. And I won't go into the philosophical implications of that. But so in other words, reality is a four-dimensional structure. And this nexus of connections here also includes all the processes that go on inside the brain. So there's quite a complicated relationship between the phenomenal space which you observe and the outside space, but it's all defined in terms of this four-dimensional structure. But then the question is, can we extend this to non-physical percepts? Well, for example, we talk about memories. Now, of course, neuroscientists assume that memories are stored in the brain. But if the event itself, the image of the event itself is not in the brain, then the memory can't be in the brain. So you have this alternative view that actually memory arises because you've essentially, your consciousness has got access to the space-time point corresponding to the original event. And so, in other words, what this is saying is that the brain contains a tag, not a trace. So there's a connection from your brain to the event in space-time. So it's essentially a sort of memory as a re-experiencing of the past. Now, that's an implication of this model I've just given you, and I'll be very interested to see how Alex reacts to that. But of course, memories are fairly normal, but what about all these other experiences, the psychic experiences, mystical experiences? My claim is we need a space and time for mind, but it's not the normal space and time. So this is the picture of Descartes. And it's what I call a universal structure. And it's a higher dimensional reality structure, which in some sense is going to be able to be the arena for normal, paranormal, and spiritual mystical experiences. An obvious example is dream space, because the point about dream space is that it does take part in a space. And if you have lucid dreams, they are very, I do have lucid dreams, and I can't, to be honest, tell the difference between when I'm awake or asleep, at least not by how things appear. And so you need a space. I'm going through this fast. This is Price proposed that you actually have a separate space for dreams. We inhabit two worlds simultaneously, the world of common experience and another space quite as real. Continuous dreamlight goes on throughout our waking hours, and occasionally we may catch a glimpse of it. So it's like the stars, which are there even in the daytime, we just don't see them. And Broad, the philosopher, famous philosopher, 20th century, said he tried to merge dream and phenomenal space into a single space in more than 3 dimensions. But now what about psychic phenomena? I've mentioned dreams. They seem to need a space. Apparitions, most people would dismiss apparitions as hallucinations, most neuroscientists would, but there are collective cases where more than one person will see the apparition. It's as though it's in a space, but not physical space. There are out-of-body experiences. Again, people I have out-of-body experiences myself. You're in a space, it's rather like the physical world, and you might say it's all an illusion, but the fact is that it seems very real, and indeed people, you sometimes will see something happening at a distant place, or sometimes you might even be seen by someone else when you're out of your body. And they're near-death experiences, which of course also involve a sort of space, you know, a tunnel, the being of light, crossing bridges and things like that. So my point is that you actually need a space for mind. And so you need a space which is bigger than physical space, because obviously these things aren't taking place in physical space, but also contains it. And so my model, this is too technical, this slide, but my model is that you have this universal structure. And the idea is mental experiences can be accommodated in a higher dimensional reality structure, reconciling all our different experiences of the world. It has a hierarchical structure which incorporates physical space as non-physical parts accessed only by the mind. So you remember this was the definition of reality I gave when we talked about the old Newtonian view, but we've seen that even within physics itself, that you have to go from 4 to 5 to 6 dimensions, etc. And this is a picture, which is, again, I hope it's not too technical. This is the picture I showed before. This is your physical experiences. This is the physical space-time, which is 4-dimensional. But now you extend this to include your non-physical fields, which means your psychic and mystical experiences, transpersonal experiences. And the idea is this is higher dimensional reality structure, which has got more than, it's got D dimensions. D is a number which I'll leave free for the time being. But then the key point of this is that then I identify this higher dimensional space with that Randall-Sundrum model, you remember, which was, again, came out of M-theory, and this is basically saying, I'll just remind you, that says the physical world is a slice of a higher dimensional space. That's straight physics. Not all physicists believe it. But then you've got to ask, well, what else is in those higher dimensions? And what I'm saying is, the only thing I'm aware of are my mental experiences, including my psychic and mystical experiences. So I'm trying to map them into this higher dimensional space. So in a nutshell, that is what the paradigm I'm proposing is. So this is how I'm trying to extend physics, if you like, because this is a picture of physics, to accommodate mind. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to bring Alex back in again to see how he reacts as a neuroscientist.
That's interesting, Bernard, because I feel like if that was a concert, you're playing there with your slides and your instruments, and from time to time I get in stage with my guitar and play some chords. It's a curious format we're exploring today together. I think it's working for me. I hope it's working for the rest. Okay, so you said a few things that interest me very much. You said the history of physics is that of increasing dimensionality. And so I wanted to add to the notion, there are two like deluxe abstractions here, hardcore concepts, which are dimensions, and another one that's used very much and maybe taken for granted given how important it is fields. So we have dimensions and fields. And these were brought up by mathematicians, of course, and physicists. And they may sound, and they are, like big abstractions, but I want again to bring them back to concrete experience, especially because another thing you mentioned is that it's true that in physics, often what is explained or proposed defies common sense reality. Now, if we move to the study of the mind and experience, well, there are also so-called anomalous experiences, which in a way, they're not so uncommon, perhaps. What could count amongst them? Lucid dreaming, near-death experiences, which maybe they're more rare because not everybody goes through them, but then terminal lucidity is another phenomenon that happens to people and to more people than you think. If you start asking, or if you say you had, for instance, a near-death experience, then some people may approach you and say, oh, I also had it, but I thought this kind of experience had to be explained away. Maybe I'm mad, maybe I'm stupid, so I won't say it. So my point here is that although we're dealing with hardcore abstractions, they may map very naturally to the experiences of people, including also psychedelics and so on. Now, so this brings us to what I like to call the edges of consciousness, again, in this map metaphor. People study consciousness in different ways, but then there are all these phenomena at the borders. Again, invoking a kind of Hobbiton. Hobbiton is nice, but who wants to go to Mordor for an excursion, right?
Sorry, well, what was the word? Hobbiton?
Hobbiton, if I make the analogy with the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's this territory, and some places are more easy to inhabit than others, but there are some others that are fascinating. So I think both bringing new experiences and new ways of thinking about them is what we need in this quest for a different science. Now, when it comes to brains, and you and I, Bernard, are in a way working on it because we've had a few discussions before, and I would really like to link, and this is even less than work in progress, this is work beginning to happen, to link your idea of brains, B-R-E-A-N-E-S, B-R-I-N-E-S, with brains, right? Because perhaps the link there is even more literal than we may think. Because my own way of approaching neuroscience is to go back to William James' essay on immortality, which I suggest everyone to Google it, download the PDF and read on immortality. It is a matter that concerns us all, right? Because we're all going to die. And William James was a great scientist and a brilliant writer. So you'll enjoy it. It's guaranteed. And in talking about immortality or on immortality, William James makes a distinction that has eluded cognitive scientists and neuroscientists for decades, more than a century now, I think, which is that of course, the brain, as we like to say, with these filler verbs, plays a very important role. Of course. Now, can we be more subtle than this? And so William James says, well, brain has function in thought, sure, and in many other processes. Now, what's the nature of this function? And this is a very simple distinction, so powerful. Is it productive or is it permissive? Does the brain produce, and then ... add there what you want, perception, memory, attention, consciousness, blah, 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 or does the brain permit that we remember or that we perceive or that we are aware? And that's in a way what I'm trying to recover, right? Let's say in recovering the sacred, the little corner I'm working on is in neuroscience, recovering this notion of permissive brain function. And so if you would ask me how the sacred neuroscience could look like, well, in your case, Bernard, it seems like this hyperdimensional view can help. I think going back to Henry Bergson, I think a Bergsonian neuroscience is a really beautiful way to go to try to extend neuroscience. And I'll tell you in a moment what this entails. And let me joke and say that I think I know 2.5 people, 2.5 scientists who are Bergsonian, and one neuroscientist that's Bergsonian, maybe 1.5. It's a small field, and you'll see why in a moment. Now, back to sacred and the definition and the antonyms and profane and secular. Now, if you double click, I told you about an antonym of sacred, it's profane. Profane means outside the temple. Temple means consecrated space. And then I went further, and what's consecrated? Of course, here the definitions start to be circular, because in consecrated, it evokes sacred, and that's where I started, but that's fine. That's how dictionaries work, by the way. Now, consecrated space, holy, you get consecrated is holy, and holy comes, or has to do, of course, resonates with whole. So not partial or incomplete or broken. So I think Bergson offers really a holistic neuroscience, as opposed to what I call the unholy trinity in the sciences, which is reductionism, mechanicism, and materialism. Now, we're working on this unholy trinity to making it more holy, and many reductionists already acknowledge that, well, I'm not metaphysically saying that parts are standalone. It's just epistemic. It's a way of working. So they're already saying, well, yes, we break brains or animals, or we split atoms into parts, but we'll really be considering wholes. Okay, so reductionism can be discussed now within the sciences. That's my feeling, as something that probably it's just a placeholder. It helps us, but it's not the real thing. Now, mechanicism is already today, and that's quite recent, I would argue, being made trans, like pushed beyond through organicism, at least in the life sciences, and I can say more about this later if you want. But there's the third element in this unholy trinity, which is materialism, which many won't let go to it. They'll say, no, I'm not a reductionist. No, I'm not a mechanicist. But of course, I'm a materialist. What else could I be? Well, so I think the neurosciences today are the quantum mechanics of 100 years ago, are this place of inquiry where you'll bang into something and you won't be able to pretend you didn't bang. Like in that case quantum mechanics was measurement and matter and so on. In this case here is the mind and consciousness. So let me say a couple of things about Bergson and Bergson's notion of perception and memory, and how I think it ties in a way naturally to what you're proposing, Bernard, back to brains and brains. And it's something very fascinating about what you propose is that the brain, now if you for those neuroscientists who are hardcore physicalists, we should just point them to you, Bernard, and say, okay, here you have a cosmologist that has this hyperdimensional model. So your brain, in the view of the cosmologist now, is an event or a dot in this world line, with all these hairy world lines within this cone, right? So this is already doing what we are going towards. It is expanding our view of the brain, and it's still a very important object, and in a way it's the most mysterious perhaps we've come across, but now it is this dot in this world line. And then, as you also suggested through your images, then memories are not in the brain, perhaps they're not stored in the brain, but they are somewhere else perhaps, and the brain is able to filter them. We could start to think about in those terms. So that's one thing that Bergson said in 1896 in his book Matter and Memory, and which I'm trying to rehabilitate and see what experiments could be done. And I spoke, let me just share this because it's relevant. I spoke with a worldwide expert on memory. I could name him, but I won't. And he's really top 5 scientists, neuroscientists whose work on memory. And I asked him, could you at least conceive that memories would not be stored in the brain? And when one say in the brain, there are different views. you know, and synapses here, there, maybe in other molecules, maybe in other ways, maybe extended. I said, well, but could you just think they're not in the brain? And he said, well, that's literally unthinkable. So that was very revealing to me. Like, it's not that I don't agree, it's that I cannot even think about that. It's inconceivable, right? So this is the kind of stretching we're trying to do here with our left brain, perhaps, but with the help of the right brain. Can we even think about memory in that sense? And I think your model helps. James's essay is magnificent to understand the distinction of functions, and Bergson too. And another one that is not memory is perception, and to think of perceptual as direct, not as a representation, like a fake copy of something it's external and in a way independent of us, that's represented in the brain, but something that's accessibly directly. So now what I'm doing here is just giving you some glimpses. I'm not, you know, giving you details, but there are ways to think about minds and brains in this way that I think very naturally flow back into this sort of anomalous experiences, and that you also represented in your graph, that go from having coffee in the morning and they get more subtle into, again, lucid dreams and even mystical experiences. And so that's the kind of, I think, neuroscience, and also in your case, the kind of physics we would want to have more people work on. And it's not just interesting, to me, it brings me joy. It's joyful. As you're doing science, then it's a different experience also for the scientists to work on these themes like this. So I will leave it there and hand it back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. And well, I have to say, of course, I agree with what you're saying. I'm very grateful for your pointing out the links with the thoughts of James and Bergson. And indeed, I'm also a great admirer of James and Bergson. And as far as I can see, James and Bergson's views are very much in accord with the sort of view I've been describing. And also, you made the reference to the unholy trinity. Well, of course, the unholy trinity are precisely the assumptions that underlie scientism, which, of course, I started off by saying one has to go beyond. I think, I mean, to me, this is really the crucial question. Is the brain a producer of consciousness or a transmitter or filter of consciousness? And although 99% of neuroscientists think it's a producer, as your colleague said, it was unthinkable that it shouldn't be a producer. It seems to me that there is no clear evidence for that. And in fact, it's quite hard to think of experiments to distinguish between these two views. And likewise, the question of whether memory is in the brain. Yeah. I mean, that's the standard view, but I don't think there's any evidence, because the point is the brain does not have experience. And the point I think I want to make here is that consciousness is not described by physics. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about, and it would be too long because we're overshooting our time, is the nature of time. We haven't actually talked about time yet, but the key point I would want to make is that consciousness involves a passage of time. Relativity theory cannot describe the passage of time. I even have a diagram, but I don't think I'm going to risk opening up another set of slides. But there is no passage of time in relativity, because in relativity theory, you have the block universe. But even quantum theory actually doesn't have the passage of time. The time has a somewhat different view. So you have to go beyond relativity theory, and you have to go beyond quantum theory in order to describe the experience of consciousness. And in fact, in my perception, you have to go into a five-dimensional model. Well, of course, I'm already invoking other dimensions, but what I'm claiming is that you need 5 dimensions. And so you're already going beyond the standard physics. But on the other hand, I'm arguing that this could be your final theory of physics. Now, of course, if you can't have consciousness in the standard physics, nor can you have memory, nor can you have any experience at all. And of course, this And the key thing I wanted to point out is that if you've got this universal structure, which is higher dimensional reality, it's implying a connection between all our minds. So that although we think all our minds are separate, the cat in your brain is separate from the cat in my brain. In fact, the whole point of this universal structure, if you like, is that our minds are all connected as part of one big mind. Okay, mind with a capital M. So our consciousness with a little c is all part of the big consciousness, which is what's being filtered. And so that's the key implication, really, of this higher dimensional picture, that there is one, there is a universal mind, which of course is a well-known, a very familiar idea from a mystical perspective, but not well accepted, of course, from a physical perspective. But now, Alex, we had various other topics, but I'm aware of the fact we've already run out of time. The other things we were going to talk about was, the implications for life, because we haven't actually spoken so much about life yet, and the whole question of sacredness and life being sacred on earth. A lot of the previous talks discussed, the sanctity of nature, if you like. And we haven't talked about that at all. So that was the section which is going to be on life and nature. And then we were going to have a final section on the return to the sacred, where we were going to say a little bit about how this all relates to the sacred, because as you say, the discussion has been rather, left hemispheric at the moment. It's rather cognitive, and we haven't said too much about how this relates to the sacred. Do all these theories, which actually attempt to accommodate spirit, mind and spirit, do they make you more spiritual? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't feel I'm more spiritual just because I've got a theory of spirituality. But what I think at this point, Alex, because we run over time, we did start late, but we've still overrun. I think we should now, James, open up the discussion to the floor, and maybe some of the other points we were going to make about, life, the sanctity of life and things like that will come out in the discussion. So I do apologize, we've taken longer than expected, but as I say, we did start late, but nevertheless, I don't know how much time we have for the general discussion, James.
Well, I would say we have a good 20 minutes for general discussion, then we can close it. It usually takes a while to close, so we'll have those 5 minutes for a final close, but 20 minutes for open discussion. So if you would like to make a contribution or ask a question, you can use the raise your hand function, which is reactions at the bottom of your screen, or you can even write your question in the chat and I can read it out to you. The only thing I do ask is just out of respect to the speakers and everyone else in the room, if your questions could be more focused and to the point, that would be great. I don't see any hands up as of yet. There was a question in the chat that is interesting. So Tim asks, some works in philosophy of physics have actually enhanced connection with common sense reality, in particular by distinguishing within reality both actuality and possibility, i.e. not accepting actualism. This is done in the works of Ruth Kastner, Transactional Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics, Michael Epperson, and Timothy Eastman, Untying the Gordian Knot. Any comment on the concern of these authors with positions that presume that the real is nothing but the actual?
Totally. This is a perfect question. Thank you so much. Indeed, I think one of the ways in which one can summarize what quantum mechanics may be about is the realization that what is real is what is actual, but also what is virtual or potential. So it's an enlarging of, again, this territory of the real. And so there are these things that are imaginary mathematically, or that live in that other space, maybe related to Bernard. I'm curious what he thinks about these other spaces that are space of the virtual in a way. And only when certain things are done, which is very mysterious still to me, measurement, they collapse, they kind of go to this other world of the actual, and then we have a measurement, and then something happened in the world. Now, this is in quantum mechanics, but then we have the philosophy of Whitehead, of course, and he also articulates those ideas mathematically and philosophically as to events in the future, and then they concrete, and then they become actual occasions. So he has this other like complex jargon to speak about those things. This is also found in Bergson. The way to conceive memories. Where are memories if they're not in the brain? Are they in my body? Well, no. Are they extended in the world? Not really. Where are they? They're nowhere. How come? Well, because they're not actually there. They're virtually somewhere. And so precisely, this distinction between actual and virtual is essential, and I think it's also essential to be able to do a science of consciousness that doesn't go endless in kind of this rather stupid, if I would say, materialist loops. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, I didn't try to talk about quantum theory because it's too big of a topic. But of course, I did hint that what's interesting about quantum theory is that it hints that consciousness may play a role, the observer may play a role in the universe, but of course the point about quantum theory is that it makes a distinction between the potential world. You know, you describe systems by a wave function, and all the potential states are there potentially, but then the observation collapses it to make what is actual. So the emphasis is always on the distinction between the potential of quantum world of quantum theory and the actual world after you've got the collapse. But what I don't want to get into a discussion of quantum theory because there's so many different interpretations. You know, there's the Copenhagen view, the transactional view, there's the many worlds view, and I'm familiar with Ruth's arguments as well. But all I would say is that, remember, quantum theory itself is not the final theory of physics. I've talked about having relativity theory in the microscopic domain and quantum theory in the microscopic domain. The final theory, which is going to marry those two, goes beyond relativity, goes beyond both of them. And so some of the concepts that arise in the quantum picture, such as, you know, potential systems, etc., they must be part of this unified theory. In my own approach, the final theory is a higher-dimensional theory, and this higher-dimensional theory itself contains the phenomena of quantum theory. So in some sense, all those potential states in quantum theory are part of this higher-dimensional reality structure. And but I don't want to go into it in any more detail, but it's a very important, sorry, I think Carolyn asked the question. It's a very important question, you know, how you do relate those different, but it all comes down to the, you know, the meaning of this word reality. And in this higher-dimensional space, things which you might think were only potential in some sense can become real in the higher-dimensional space. But I think I better stop there.
Let me add something very quickly, because the word of David Bohm, whom you know we work and promote here in Pari. Well, cool. The implicate and the explicate could be another way to talk about this dance between potential and actual, right? The implicate becomes explicate and then implicate again. So one could even say the sacred becomes secular and then sacred again. It's an interesting dance if you consider it like this. So, or like the kind of a pregnant meditative silence becomes an explicit WhatsApp message that then becomes again a pregnant meditative silence. So there's this movement, I think, and many authors, physicists, philosophers, and mystics, of course, have spoken about them. Perhaps it's a harsh analogy, but it also helps to see what may be happening.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, I mentioned David Bohm briefly, but I would say David Bohm's ideas, the implicate order, things like that, I mean, I would say they go beyond quantum theory itself. I would say David Bohm's, you know, implicit and explicit maps up with this higher-dimensional picture. And of course, not only David, you know, also, you know, obviously David Peat and the whole Pari group have also been interested in that idea.
Yes.
But anyway, I think we should maybe go on to another question. I can see other hands.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, let's go to Olga next.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, guys. I'm very, very happy to see you in a Zoom window. I've followed you both online for a while. So I'm a mathematician. I came from electrical engineering and computer science, and I I arrived at this with this group of people because of my own dissatisfaction with materialism and the unholy trinity or whatever. So I wanted to first of all thank you for all of these ideas, and I can only understand them to an extent, but I'm very excited. And I wanted to point to two ideas, like, because I guess Alex is giving us the cognitive view, the consciousness view, the neuroscience view, and then Bernard is giving us a physics view. And I just wanted to point out two ideas from mathematics, and it's equally unusual that you find mathematicians like having a a non-standard view. So I totally sort of relate with what you guys said. And maybe we can talk offline at some point. I could be very excited about that because I don't want to hijack this conversation. Two things. One of them has to do with geometry and one of them has to do with algebra. And for the rest of the people, I already put a comment about this on Sutra, so I apologize that I'm repeating myself. I just wanted to bring this here as well. So one of them, the geometric idea, has to do with, I mean, Bernard started the historical overview with Newton and 3D space, right? And 3 dimensions and all that. There's this idea of counter space that came from, well, Rudolf Steiner and some of the anthroposophy people from the beginning of the 20th century. This is very new to me. It's literally some months that I heard of this and I'm sort of looking into this, so I will not do it justice for sure.
What was the word? Sorry, counter space. I missed the word.
Counter space. So it's an idea. So I'm speaking about this because, as you said, like the language of physics is mathematics. So I think there's a huge, like, if we can also change the language, that might actually, you know, help with a number of things. And the idea of counter space is that you don't just speak of an object as an object, which means, okay, we perceive objects with our touch and with our vision and whatnot. But how about if we try to also speak about the background, like the thing that is not the object, the thing that is around, the thing that when we zoom in with our attention, with our focus, and with our, you know, left-brained discerning whatever, when we draw the lines and we're saying this is what we attend to, this is what we focus on, the thing that we exclude, I would say, is something that belongs to this realm of counter space. And I was wondering, because you guys also talked about alternative spaces and, like, you know, where does the potential in quantum mechanics live? Where do memories live? Like, how can we speak of these things? I mean, it's an abstraction. It's not like, you know, it's a way of thinking. But there's this idea of, like, you know, depending on, there's, and I would even say the idea of how do you say this? Like like where dark matter lives, perhaps, I don't know, like things that we can't speak of currently. Maybe we can talk about them in a language that involves this counter space thing. And I would even say that, like, all of our math came out of this idea of Newtonian space, right? Like of even like Cartesian space even. And all of that goes back to Euclid and the idea of, like, Euclidean geometry in the plane. And this counter space really goes that back and tries to speak of, you know, duality between planes and points and whatnot. So it's a really fundamental change into geometry that I think might perhaps be an avenue to speak of things in physics that are sort of, you know, maybe, or in all these realms, you know, like whenever, yeah, it's really one thing. And the other thing that goes mostly to Bernard's realm, I guess, but like I heard of a thing called intuitionist mathematics recently, from a person called Nicholas Gizin at ETH Zurich, an emeritus professor of quantum mechanics. And he made the same point that you did, that neither relativity theory or quantum theory actually describe the passage of time. And he makes an argument that one reason why that might be is because our mathematics are talking about numbers as if, like, a real number has this definition involving infinite series. Even to speak about what the number 3 is, you need to have infinity knowledge of, like, everything to know that your infinite series converges to the number 3. So he really proposes a new way of defining a number that doesn't require that. In fact, he builds indeterminacy in the definition of numbers so that you state that you never know a number fully. And he suggests that we do our physics based on this new number thing. So anyway, I'm sorry, I ran on for way too much longer than I planned. but I just wanted to bring this up because I think there's some interesting ideas like in other realms that could potentially be combined with some of the guys that, you know, the things that you guys talked about. So
thank you so much, Olga. Maybe I could react. First of all, can you spell the name of the second person? Gazim or something?
Gisin, Nicholas.
Yes, yes, right. Well, first of all, I have heard of Gissin's ideas. I have to say, I'd never heard of counter space before. So I'm very glad you brought it to my attention, and would be grateful if maybe you could send me the reference.
Yes, I will.
To the work. Yeah, you can get my email address, I'm sure, from Pari. But the point is, it's really very relevant, because the point is this higher dimensional model is ultimately obviously very mathematical. The mathematics is very complicated. You know, that's why people after 30 years still haven't solved all the equations of M theory and things like that. And we don't know what branch of mathematics, you know, maybe we'll again even need new mathematics in order to describe the results of this. Now, obviously in this presentation, I've not gone into any mathematical details. And also, neither do I have necessarily the mathematical expertise, because it's what I've described is not a final theory. It's an approach, you know. And I don't have the detailed equations. I mean, Alex referred to fields. This is essentially a sort of field theory, rather like Einstein's theory of general relativity. But the point is, I don't have a final mathematical set of equations to describe this. And it may well be that this concept of counter space, which you refer to, you know, is important. I don't know. I'm not sure I even have the mathematical capability to understand it, you know, because Einstein's relativity theory, general relativity, is rather complicated mathematically. And so whatever the theory of this higher dimensions is going to be, it's not going to be easy either.
Right.
And so that's very relevant. But I do think that this higher dimensional perspective, whatever mathematics requires, is going to elucidate both quantum theory and mentality. It's going to bring them together, I believe, I hope. But thank you so much for raising that point, Olga, and I'll be grateful if you could send me the references to the counter space work.
I'll write you an email. Thank you.
And I'd love to talk to you offline too. Let me just quickly react. I think in biology, not only in physics or neuroscience, so for the study of life, again, not just matter, energy, or mind, but life, I think we need new mathematics. And I've been desperately trying to find mathematicians that would do so. There's a group in Paris, Longo, Giuseppe Longo, who, and then we're working on this. The homework for mathematicians would be, please write down an equation that could change itself.
Yep.
That's what we need. And
so
not
the number thing. It's sort of really like, that's the idea that if you don't know a number fully, you can have the physical model afterwards. You know, you can have your PDE or whatever it is. But you build the uncertainty in it because your number changes. So the result will change because your numbers change. So it's,
yes, and the trick between parameters and meters won't work. So it's it's like a right brain kind of mathematics that we're missing. And again, Whitehead has his own theory of relativity, and Bergson has this notion of multiplicity, which is very strange. Is heterogeneous continuity. It's that allows for things to penetrate themselves, and so yes, we need that, and let's talk more about it. Also, James, let me say, because I was late because I had a problem, I had to come back from my office. I don't want to rush. I see 4 hands. I mean, I can stay as long as needed to answer to everybody.
I can stay for eternity if necessary, but I don't think anyone else.
So I don't want to rush the or miss questions if there are, because we took a lot of time presenting and also I was late. But just so we can breathe.
But Olga, thank you. But Olga, I noticed you already put the paper in the chat. I don't know how you managed to do it and talk at the same time, but I've already downloaded it, but I haven't had time to read it.
Okay.
And Steiner, and thank you for bringing Steiner. Unfathomable work. I mean, come on. This thing he also did, I can't believe it. I need to look at it.
It's all very new to me, but I find it very promising. So
yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Olga. So yeah, I mean, I think we can go for another maybe 10 minutes for the Q&A. You happy with that?
I am, certainly. It's up to the audience. Yes.
Great. Well, next then let's go to Max.
Yes. Hi. Okay. So to be quick, I have two quick things. One is just if the relationship or the overlap or commonality of memory and imagination, and the other because you talked about Esalen, and one of my sort of favorite thinkers is Gregory Bateson, who also spent time in Esalen.
Yeah.
And Steps Toward an Ecology of Mind, which seemed to me, a movement in the direction that you've gone, opened it way up. But of these, it's basically saying that all of this stuff about genes and it's all information. It's a realm of mind, and
Yes.
so that's my prompt for what I'd like you to respond to.
Well, shall I go first, Alex?
Yes.
I mean, first of all, I think I mentioned both myself and Alex have referred to memory, and we both, I think, advocated this view that memory is not inside the brain. The brain contains a tag rather than a trace, because indeed there's no experience as such in the brain. But you also mentioned imagination, so I would like to focus on that, and that brings in the whole concept of creativity. And because I think that's the other key thing which is missing in a normal reductionist materialist view. There's no reference to imagination or creativity. Now, to me, creativity is, in some sense, is a reflection of these higher dimensions. I mean, because part of these one of the roles of this higher dimensional space is that it does connect our minds. So first of all, it means that when you're creative from this perspective, it's not all coming from inside your head. I mean, obviously, most people would like to think when they have great poetry or great music or whatever, it's coming inside their head. But from this perspective, when you're highly creative, and if you're a genius, the idea is that actually you're linking with something outside your individual mind. You're linking with this universal mind, if you like, whatever phrase you want to use. And indeed, what we call imagination is something which comes from outside, your own head, at least from this perspective, not from a neuroscientist perspective. And so, and this raises the whole question of what creativity is. And I will only give my own very everything I say is speculative, but ultra speculative view. I'm fascinated in creativity, and we've talked about the mystery of time and how you can't describe time within normal general relativity. You actually need a higher dimension. This higher dimension actually is, in some sense, in my picture, these higher dimensions correspond to higher levels of time. And the question is, what is creativity? Now, I've always been fascinated because I'm interested in precognition. Okay. And I know most scientists may be skeptical of that, but personally, I do believe precognition because you can see the future. And so I've been fascinated in the question, Mozart creates a symphony. If you believe in precognition, he should be able to hear his own symphony in the future. And indeed, Mozart did hear music. So then you have the paradox, well, if he's having if you've got precognition, can Mozart hear the symphony which he's going to compose? Well, that sounds crazy, but it's just the idea of a closed loop in time. And I think that creativity has got some link with closed time-like curves. And I think consciousness has something to do with closed time-like curves. Because in my particular approach, I haven't had time to talk about it, consciousness has a minimum time scale. It's what I call the specious present, which is actually a term which Bergson used a lot. So I think Alex will have something to say about this. Consciousness comes in discrete amounts, which for a human is about 1/10 of a second. This is the specious present. And in my way of looking at things, consciousness corresponds to sort of like a closed time-like curve, because there's no distinction between past and future within the specious present. But in certain states of consciousness, you can expand your specious present so that you have what you might call a precognitive experience, for example. And I think that creativity somehow links with this expanded specious present. Now, this answer is going way beyond the question you probably, the answer you probably intended me to have. But to me, I just think the question of creativity is a crucial clue. And I also think in some sense, when we're talking about where is the sacred in the world, because we haven't talked too much explicitly about sacred, to me, the sacred comes in this creativity. And if you like, in the imagination, which is the term you use. And I think it's all to do, because whatever you're going to call God, God transcends time in the normal sense of the word. And that's what's allow you to have these closed time-like curves. So maybe that's a rather technical answer, but I'm afraid you just set me off. Alex, you can bring us down to earth, perhaps. You're muted, Alex.
I'll do so briefly with one sentence. I'll read the last sentence of Bergson's Matter and Memory, you'll see. So that's the sentence. Spirit borrows from matter the perceptions on which it feeds and restores them to matter in the form of movements which it has stamped with its own freedom. That's a pretty
yeah, very.
So back and forth. And I leave it here because I could say more things, but I'd rather listen to other comments and questions. Thank you.
I might say Alex has written a wonderful review of a book by Lundy about Bergson. And so I can recommend that review if you want to understand. But Bergson himself is rather hard to understand, and it's easier to understand Alex explaining his views, perhaps. But thank you for that question.
We can bring in Kathleen now. Kathleen, would you like to join the call?
Thank you. I have a question, but I just wanted to go back to Olga's comment on a new language for numbers, and I would offer that we also need a new language in which how we speak, because what happens is we constantly are in this either or place. We talk about expression mostly, and we rarely marry a language which I and separate from that do in my own work, the marriage of that fifth element or quintessence and expression. And so we speak in expression, but we do not bring those two parts together to integrate them. So when I'm in my own work, when we're using language, we are actually using language that is essence and expression, but not separated by an and, but rather essence expression. So always two words, the essence part and the expression part as a single word, capital essence, capital expression, one word, which has people understand that there is something outside of this egoic experience that we're having. So I'll just park that. And I was struck, Alex, by your comment about that you tire of headlines like scientists, experts say. Well, imagine then the plight of the mystic. So I would propose, and I would ask either of you to comment on this, that Bernard's levels of normal to spiritual exist as potentiality in every single one of us. Our access, however, depends on our availability to that universal mind and our practice and awareness. Can you comment on that?
Yes.
So do you want to go first, Alex?
Go, Bernard. I see.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Kathleen. I mean, your point about language is very interesting. And as you say, one does need a new language. I referred briefly about the mathematics being a language. And I think that's a special language which is probably going to be useful, if not essential, for understanding this sort of picture. But to me, your question goes deeper than that, because, I mean, one thing I never talked about explicitly was the whole question of meaning. You know, my picture of this extended reality was really all based on a sort of extension of visual perception. I mean, not necessarily physical visual perception, but some form of sensory experience in some higher dimensional sense. But that, of course, makes no reference to meaning. And it's clear that meaning is crucial. And even within physics, meaning comes in, because now in physics, a lot of people take the view that information is fun. You know, we talk about mass and then we talked about energy, and now people tend to think of information as fundamental, and that also links to meaning. So I mean, I don't have an answer to your question of what that language should be, but I completely agree that we are struggling for a new, one's always needing a new language. Not only does science have to constantly be modified to take in new domains, so does language. And I think you're quite right that we probably need a new language to talk about these things. But of course, part of that new language will also be the new mathematics, which Olga referred to. And so, yes, I think that's really important. You made a second point, and I've forgotten what your last point was now.
The idea that the levels that you talked about from normal to spiritual, that potentiality isn't something that some people have and others don't. It is a potentiality that lives within us all. And my question was, I think I would propose that it depends on our availability to this so-called universal mind, and then our practice and awareness to be in touch with that. And that's what I was asking for the comment on.
Oh, thank you. Absolutely. Well, Alex, maybe I can go ahead while I've got the floor, so to speak, but that is so important. I mean, clearly, most people, my impression is that a lot of people have some experience of the psychic and spiritual domains, but not many people have, a profound experience. And I have to say myself, I'm not a very spiritually evolved person. I mean, I have, I meditate and things like that, but I know I'm not going to get enlightened in this lifetime. I'm rather spiritually backwards. But nevertheless, I have had sufficient experience to convince me that these other levels of reality do exist. I mean, I've had out-of-body experiences, I've seen things and heard things which don't exist physically. So even I feel I've had some experience of these, if you like, higher levels of consciousness. And I'm sure one can, clearly some people experience them at greater depth with greater continuity and indeed experience higher levels. But obviously you're quite right that potentially all of us can have these experiences. And I suppose this comes back to the question of, well, what world do you live in? Do you live in the material world, or do you live in the intellectual world, or do you live in the spiritual world? And I would say we
live in all three of them, I would say.
Exactly. That's why I said in the beginning, you need to be in all three worlds. But actually the mental world, if anything, I think stops you having these experiences. I mean, although I'm trying to have if you like, an intellectual theory of spiritual experience, intellect doesn't very much help when you're having a spiritual experience. If you're having a spiritual experience and you start trying to analyze it mathematically, I'm quite sure the spiritual experience stops. So there's a distinction between having an intellectual model of these higher experiences and actually having the higher experiences. And I'm not sure whether having a higher dimensional theory of spiritual experience will make people more spiritual. But I do think if we're going to become more spiritual, if scientists are going to become more spiritual, they will need to have such a paradigm in the background. Yes. Sorry, over to you, Alex.
I'll answer to your three questions in headline mode because time is running short. But some people cynically think that language was invented to lie. I don't think so, but I think what language does is reveal things, but it necessarily has to hide things as it reveals it. So there's something there that's inherent in it. So we should not blame language for not being able to convey certain things. And I'm not saying you do. I'm not saying you do, but it's inbuilt in language, and that's why the poets transcend it. They've transcended the use, and we scientists still figuring it out. Now, when you say expert says, this triggers me immediately. So let me just double click on says. We always told show, don't tell. As scientists, show the data, don't tell. But expert says is says. So it brings us back to this social construct. It's like, you don't need to look at it. The expert will say it because, come on, you won't understand it anyway. So believe in them. That's why I think it's very dangerous if that game is not played well. And then the word expert before says, it's also pretty cool because experts, but are those who have experience? And what about the rest? In Portuguese, experiment and experience are the same word. I think that's a good thing. So perhaps that's what we're trying, not which just experts.
Yes, which I would say, Alex, is the challenge of the mystic.
Yes.
or the yes.
Yeah. So it's an expert in that sense, a transcendent
Yes.
expert. And
Yes.
so let's avoid these categories of the experts that say or tell but don't show, or those poor of us, the poor lay people who, no, we should be able to
Yes.
access those things. And finally, because you spoke about access, and I'm gonna sound weird, but unfortunately or not, I'm a white heterosexual male, but I think I can also embody feminine qualities. And I think what science needs is to be more feminine. And that involves access from this permissive view of the brain rather than productive, has to do with receptivity and creativity. So there are these kind of spiritual / feminine qualities that we can work on to make that science we're looking for possible.
I'm chuckling in recognition because just yesterday I wrote a piece for the people I'm working with around masculine and feminine integration. Just yesterday.
Can you share it in the chat?
Oh, it's a very small piece, very, very small, but I can put it in the chat.
Yes.
I can share it with you later.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Niels, would you like to come in? We are almost running out of time, so I do ask Niels and Hugh if you could keep your questions to the point so that come in, Niels.
I shall try to. I could talk all night about what I could bring onto this table. You talk about mathematics. For many years, I was involved in mathematics as a structural engineer. That's mathematics and things, but that's also structural engineering is also processing. So you can see the forces that go into structures. You can see as potential in the structure you have built, and then you can then follow it in the opposite direction, and that then becomes the unfolding, if you like. So in that sense, the implicate order is the potential, and you can gauge that from your structure. And so what I wanted to say, very early in my career, I realized that mathematics is far too complicated to be really useful. And from what you have talked about mathematics, that kind of underpins that mathematics, like general relativity, is to actually use it for anything sensible is very, very difficult. So in an early age, I gave up my career as a structural engineer after 4 years because I saw that computers was going to be the answer to my problems. So I've spent 51 years in that. And then I'm thinking about Bohm was always punching on to Niels Bohr about quantum mechanics. And in the end, Bohr got irritated with him, and he said, it's only an algorithm. That is a prescription for calculation. And in a way, that is algebra, as far as I can see. So what I've done in computing never goes any further than algebra and process. So when I heard about A.N. Whitehead, and he said process and reality, I immediately understood what it was, and I actually have an algorithm that, in that respect, will show you what reality is in any network. So network is about connecting and interacting and talking together. It's actually about understanding. So I'll just fire one thing off from another famous Dane, Søren Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard said something that William James was really interested in, but because he only spoke and wrote in Danish, a friend of James knew Kierkegaard, so he could. So what Kierkegaard says, we live forward, but we understand backwards. And I can tell you now that the thing that quenches the problem of complexity, because now I have a model for complexity. Whenever I listen to the left brain discussing possibilities and what could be, I am beginning to get tired. I'm not one of those fancy technologists who peddle hubris or anything like this. This is just calmly something, and from the perspective of the sacred. Since I've been a little child, I've had this sense of something much larger than me, and that much larger than me would help me when I got stuck into problems. So I would suggest that, I know Stephen Hawking also talked about computers. He believed that one day we would find something called superintelligence. But he was frightened of it being something that was going to be evil and basically kill the biological mankind off, and everyone would end into a cosmic war between robots. I don't believe in that, but there is in a materialistic sense you can achieve these things. So
thank you, Niels.
Yes, sorry. So
Bernard, would you like to come in and?
Yes, Niels, you made many interesting points, and I can only respond briefly. Yeah. First of all, of course, I agree mathematics is difficult, but I think one nevertheless has to. It's still very useful, and I would say indispensable. Yes. It's just the fact that it's difficult. It's just a fact of life, and indeed one of the problems with talking about a theory like this is that, even if there is such a final theory, it doesn't have to be mine, but whatever the theory is, it won't be easy to understand. I mean, our most successful theory in the world is probably general relativity, but it's mathematically very difficult. And you can conceptually explain it, but the fact is it's difficult. But the question, to me, the miracle is that our limited brains are able to understand that the world so as much as they do after just a few thousand years. Presumably, whatever this great cosmic mind is, it's probably a much better mathematician than we are, and a much more intelligent than us. Astrid, I was interested in what you said, and of course, I think I'm going to leave Alex to comment on Whitehead, because I think Whitehead's ideas of process, emphasizing a process is really crucial to this higher dimensional perspective. Yes. And indeed the speech is present. I find the whole link with computer science and developments in artificial AI very interesting. And some people talk about whether machines are going to develop consciousness, and this is a vexed issue. I don't see why they shouldn't. If you believe in the filter theory, it says that whenever you have a physical system of sufficient complexity, it should be able to act as a filter. So I don't see why a computer shouldn't, in principle, develop some form of consciousness or even some form of soul, because the soul isn't being generated, it's just being filtered through it. And finally, you mentioned Stephen Hawking, who I knew well. Stephen, of course, would not believe in anything I've said today. He wasn't interested in philosophical, and he didn't believe in psychic phenomena. And that's fine, because people sometimes say, well, why didn't I try and get Stephen interested in mysticism and philosophy? And why I didn't want to, because he was a genius as a physicist. And like I said at the beginning, you have to decide whether you're going to live in the world of matter, mind, and spirit. He was a genius in the world of mind.
Yeah.
And that's where his genius resided. And he wasn't spiritual. I mean, but the irony was, although Stephen wasn't spiritual, he was still a spiritual inspiration to many people.
Yeah.
And not only through even his ideas, but also because of the way he battled his handicap. And so, but anyway, I think I will stop there because you made many points. Alex, over to you.
I'll just say that maybe another series could be devoted to not the sacred, but what secularism means. And you alluded to transhumanism, or I understood it in this way. And I think it's a really bad solution to what we did to ourselves.
Yes.
Because we kicked God out of the game.
Yes.
Then we fucked up with nature, if I can say so. So what are we left with? Ourselves and our gadgets. And so what's the salvation going to be? We're going to build these amazing gadgets, and we are going to upload ourselves into it, and so on. It's horrible, and it brings in the brain again. So secular humanism is very dangerous.
Yes, I agree with you. That wasn't what my point wasn't that. I'm just saying I'm not one of those. That's what I'm saying. Yes. Because I'm spiritual. Have always been. And I believe that gift is from the universal inspiration. We call him the Holy Spirit. And I think that is where, if you get stuck on anything, if you get tired and you work really hard, certainly the solution comes to you. Like it might just be a little string of things going on, or it might be a word. And that's been my life, and that is a holistic thing.
Yeah. Back to Kathleen's remark about grace. I was going to say, receptivity and grace. Some things are gifts; they're not our own merits and productions. Yes, I think.
I would like to do a presentation of this thing. I say that negates complexity, because it reduces, it's a reductionist thing, but it doesn't reduce the problem. It reduces the process to create the answer. And that process is so quick, and then we enter into the specious.
And Niels, can I just emphasize, I am not a supporter of transhumanism, even though I talked about the possibility of...
Nor am I, no. But I'm just saying that in the material world, in transport, if you want to understand that and give it meaning, then you enter into this sphere, which then automatically builds further on into the sacred and the super mind. We could call it the mind of God. Yes.
Maybe we should go on to Hugh now.
Yes. Thank you, Neil.
So,
come in, Hugh.
Hugh, you're mute.
You're muted, Hugh. You need to unmute. No, you're still muted.
No. Can you click that now?
How about that?
Oh, now we can hear you, Hugh.
Okay, good. All right. I simply want to pick up on the throwaway line, Alex, that you just made about fucking up the environment, which connects with a remark that Ian McGilchrist made. I was shocked to discover at the anniversary of the publication of his book, the 10th anniversary, he mentioned at the first release of the first book of The Matter with Things, he confessed that he had been having suicidal thoughts to such an extent that he had to hold on to his brother physically at the launch of the book, because he had been so overwhelmed by it in the effort of creating the 2 volumes of the book pretty well on his own all of that time. And the reason I mention it now is because he opened his online channel with this testimony that he believes that we are engaged in committing suicide, intellectual suicide, moral suicide, and physical suicide. And says that if there is anything as important as stopping us poisoning our seas and destroying our forests, it is stopping us poisoning our minds and destroying our souls. So the question I wanted to perhaps have us close this session is as follows. Can the two of you anticipate expanding the science further, the better to develop the spirit of dialogue, which David Bohm, after all, was very concerned with, and he used the term, the spirit of dialogue? Or are we still needing another bridge between our deliberations with the affairs of the world, demolishing the planet while we talk?
Well, Hugh, thank you for raising a point which I don't think either myself or Alex have actually touched on, although oddly enough our abstract did. So I think this was something Alex was wanting to stress. I mean, I noticed in our abstract we talk about how this expanded idea of science, linking science and spirituality, may heal a bifurcation that harms both our planet and our humanity. So that sentence in our abstract is very relevant to your point.
Yes.
Although we haven't actually addressed it so far. And in fact, I think that sentence in the abstract came from Alex. So, I mean, he's the best person to talk about that. But to me, I mean, life is precious and life is sacred. And unless we appreciate the sacred sanctity of nature, it will end up with our destroying our home. The planet will no longer be a fit place for humans to live. And I completely agree with this. I mean, I can't say I'm not an eco-activist or whatever, but I mean, it's clear that we are, humanity is heading towards disaster unless we do something. We've just had this latest COP meeting, which seems to have achieved nothing. Right. And when one talks about spiritual science, I talked about how scientists must become more spiritual in order to, if this new paradigm is going to have any impact. But being more spiritual and appreciating what is sacred on earth means that you will then have to be trying to preserve life on earth. And so that's why I think what Alex said at one point, it's a matter of also not just putting the science in the sacred, it's a matter of putting the sacred in the science, i.e. in the world. And I think that's true. And the only other point I would make is that I tend to think about consciousness on different levels. We think human consciousness is all there is. I think there's a hierarchy of consciousness with different species presence. There's human consciousness, there's planetary consciousness, maybe there's a galactic consciousness, maybe there's a cosmic consciousness. And in some sense, if you're going to talk about ecology, if you're going to talk about nature, I think you also need to think about the broader level of ecology, which operates on the level of stars and galaxies and the cosmos. I mean, obviously, we're only going to focus on the ecology of our planet because that's the pressing problem. But one has to be aware that what's good for us may not, there may be a galactic level of ecology which overrides the planetary level of ecology. But that's a whole new can of worms. So over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, one may say, well, we don't need more of these Zooms or more books, yet another book on saving the planet, but we do. And you could say, well, we need more good intentions. So rather than writing a book, plant a tree. And we do, but we also know that hell is, what's the line? Hell is played with good intentions too. So since we're talking about the sacred, why not end this rather long Zoom and say, well, let's do what we can and also pray. And if the word praise produces allergy to some of you, then ask. Let's do what we can and ask for a kind of miracle to happen and be willing to receive it, to take it. And or as my friend Rupert Sheldrake says, Well, we could rather ask the angels because they're very unemployed today. So why? Well, not if we really, I guess we're all here. We're still like what, 37 people after 2.5 hours talking about the sacred. If there's some hint, we really believe there's something like the sacred, whatever that is, may give us a hand if we let the thing. So, well, let's do what we can, and also ask for the rest, and maybe we can make it, or maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, thank you for that, Hugh.
Well,
and Hugh, I haven't forgotten we're going to have a meeting to discuss
yes,
general relativity, but that will be another time.
I shall have to make my way out to East London.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Any closing remarks?
I just want to, well, first of all, I want to thank Alex because it's been a very stimulating discussion, and it's also helped me to understand my ideas better. But also I want to thank the audience, because I'm so, there's still 35 people who stuck it out to the bitter end at, as Alex says, after 2.5 hours. And I'm really appreciative for your patience, but also for the questions and the many comments in the chat box, which I'm going to be reading in greater detail later. And of course, thank you for I don't know if James is there now, but Eleanor, thank you very much for overseeing everything so well. And apologies that we've overrun, but we transcend time in these theories anyway.
It was an honor. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Alex?
Oh, well, thanks to John Pickering, who's silently there.
Of course,
I see
John,
you
I'm sorry, I missed
curating this and making it happen. My two final, because I'm used to this, like Eleanor and James do that when we're really tired. So could you just wrap it up in a sentence? So I'm gonna wrap it up in 3 words, and one of them is and. So grace and will. Perhaps these are the things we need. Grace and will.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you all for being with us here today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we will have and bearing. So thank you all. And it's been a wonderful session. Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Alex. And thank you, John, of course. And we'll see you tomorrow.